me great pleasure to tell you that we are going to have a major treat now to hear from Dr. Anjan Chatterjee, and he is the author of the book, The Aesthetic Brain. But before I ask him to come up, I also want to let you know that because we had more resources this year, not only were we able to do a research project on wellness communities, as you saw this morning, but we've also engaged in a research project with Dr. Chatterjee, and the results of that will be coming out at the end of the year. And I just want to take a moment to honor the sponsors who stepped up to make that possible, and I'm going to ask them to please come up. Oh, and first, where's Mike? There's Mike. First, let me introduce Mike Brueggemann. Come on up. Mike is the head of our Beauty to Wellness initiative. And you've done roundtables in London and New York. You're doing one in Hong Kong. And this whole thing about beauty and wellness is a huge, important thing. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you invite the sponsors up.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you, Susie, for the kind introduction. In just a few moments, I'll have an opportunity to introduce Dr. Chatterjee. Before we do that, I'd like to invite our sponsors up who sponsored the initiative. Come on.
Nice to see you. Hello, good, how are you? Good. Hello, nice to see you.
Now, before I go any further, you might be wondering why they're holding frames, and I guess why I'm holding a frame too. You'll have to hang with me for a moment. And if you didn't catch that, it's time to work on the oscillation of energy, right? So each of these people on the stage have generously contributed to the research. And Linda, Karen Ballou, Brian, Pierre, Rupert. So hydrofacial, biologique recherche, comfort zone, immunology, and performance health. Thank you very much for your participation in the study. The mission of the Beauty Meets Wellness Institute and initiative is to actually do two things: to reframe the narrative and move from a conversation of anti-aging to age-embracing. And by the way, that's my word, age-embracing, so don't try to copy it in all of your editorial. And the second purpose is to scientifically connect beauty and wellness and to change the perception for something that is superficial to something that is actually meaningful to the well-being of consumers worldwide. So that's our purpose and our mission. Thank you very much for joining us today.
We want to have a photo of you all holding up your frame. I will be in the middle, if I could, and you two could be together, because it is really true. And yes, so you can be in the picture. You can be in the picture. There you go. There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And now on to Dr. Chatterjee. Dr. Chatterjee is Chief of Neurology at Pennsylvania Hospital and author of The Aesthetic Brain. We evolved, and how we evolved to desire beauty and enjoy art. So Dr. Chatterjee has many accomplishments, but one story I'd like to share with you is I invited him to join us at the Beauty Meets Wellness Initiative meeting a few months back before the research actually got started. And he was cross-examined pretty rigorously by the team, because the team is very committed to the work that they do. And I'm very pleased that he stuck with us and actually decided to continue to do the research as well. And I also found out today, as I was researching a little bit more on Dr. Chatterjee, that we're actually 4 days apart when we were born. He was born on the 16th? 20, The data's wrong in that little in that piece. Welcome, Dr. Chatterjee. You're going to come to love him as much as we do on the Beauty Initiative.
Thanks. So I was given a hard time in this phone conference, but being in academia, that is pretty much par for the course. So I do want to thank the sponsors. I'll thank people more appropriately on Wednesday when I actually give the research report. So it's 1878. This is Sir Francis Galton, and he gives a remarkable talk. He's giving a talk to the Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. And Galton was a brilliant polymath. He was smarter than anybody in this room. And probably many of you, including me, think we're pretty smart. He was an explorer. He was an anthropologist. He was a sociologist. He was a psychologist. He was a statistician. He did amazing work on human intelligence. But he was also a eugenist. And in this talk, he brought what was cutting-edge technology at the time to bring to bear on a question that he thought was important, which is, what is the nature of criminality? And so what he presented at this meeting was a way in which one could use photographs. Now remember, photographs were not very common then. One could use photographs and combine them to make a composite portrait. And what he thought was that if he could combine photographs of convicted criminals, he would discover the face of criminality. And this would be an important thing for people, for law enforcement to be able to have a prototype of what a criminal looked like. And to his surprise, instead of discovering the face of a criminal mastermind, the image he produced was beautiful. And it raises deep questions. What is the nature of beauty? Why is it that certain configurations of line and color and form excite us so? Now, poets and philosophers and artists have had a lot to say about beauty over the years, but in the last couple of decades, we've had new tools to ask these very old questions. And the new tools are ideas from evolutionary psychology and methods from neuroscience. And with these tools, we're beginning to understand a little bit about the why of beauty and the how of beauty, at least when it comes to the human face and form. And when it comes to the human face, it looks like there are three parameters that seem to be really important. One is this notion of averaging that Galton found out about serendipitously. There's a notion of symmetry, and it's the effect of hormones, particularly estrogen and testosterone, on facial features. And let's take each one of these in turn. Galton's finding that averaged faces are invariably more attractive than the individual faces that contribute to them has been replicated many times. And this notion fits quite well with many people's intuitions, which is that mixed-race people tend to be regarded as attractive. And often, if you have families that over generations have been quite inbred at the other end, people tend to find individuals from such families as less attractive. And there's a genetic story to be told about this, which is the implication is that if you have features that are combinations of features of different kinds of people, it is an expression of genetic diversity, which means that you are better able to adapt to changes in the environment. So it becomes a signal for health. Symmetry, it turns out, is also a signal for health. During the Pleistocene, which is about 2 million years, close to 2 million years, ended about between 11 and 12,000 years ago, which is when we think the modern human brain mostly evolved. Parasites were one of the biggest threats to survival. And it turns out parasites consistently, whether it's plants or animals, mammals or humans, tend to produce asymmetries. So symmetry seems to be another fitness indicator. Now, in the 1930s, this man, Maximilian Factorowicz, who was a Polish immigrant to the US, appreciated the importance of symmetry when he designed the beauty micrometer. As you can see, this beauty micrometer, maybe some of you guys use this in your spas. The beauty micrometer could measure very, very minor asymmetries, and he would then use makeup, this is where the term comes from, makeup for these asymmetries in his company that's better known as Max Factor. The third feature has to do with the effect of hormones. And everything I'm going to say is really about heteronormative standards right now. So it looks as though the features that men typically find attractive in women are brought on by the hormone estrogen. So estrogen has the following effects, which is it tends to make lips fuller, tends to make eyes larger, and it tends to make chins narrower. But there also needs to be some maturity. Otherwise, a face that is so young might imply that the woman or girl is not fertile. So high cheekbones ends up being an indicator of maturity within this mix. And so the general idea is that these measures of fertility are a kind of signal for future reproductive success. Now, when it comes to men, the effects of testosterone turn out to be more complicated. The physical effects of testosterone are that you get a kind of Dick Tracy sort of look, squared off jaw, heavier brow, narrower cheeks. But here's a fascinating irony, which is that in most animals, when it's been studied, testosterone, if anything, suppresses the immune system. So it doesn't make sense to think of these features as having anything to do with fitness. But here, the logic is turned on its head. And scientists invoke what is called a handicap principle or a costly display. And what I'm showing here is the example that is used most often for talking about a costly display in the animal world, which is the peacock's tail. The peacock's tail drove Darwin crazy. He wrote in a letter to Asa Gray, he wrote, the sight of the peacock's tail made him physically ill because he couldn't explain it. He couldn't explain why it existed through natural selection. This tail, beautiful as it might be, isn't exactly make the peacock agile to get away from predators or quickly approach mates. So out of this frustration, he ended up developing notions of sexual selection as distinct from natural selection, and the idea was that this was a display that enticed peahens, and the outcome of that would be greater reproductive success. Now, the modern twist on this is this handicap principle, which is the claim is that the peacock can advertise, can afford to divert so many resources to maintaining this tail because it is already so strong. And by analogy, what you'll appreciate is the kind of costly displays that men have right now is you might buy a $10,000 watch, right? It's a costly display, it's expending resources, completely unnecessary, right? So that's the sort of argument about this. So what happens in the brain when we see beautiful people? Oh, I forgot. I want to talk about this. So when people hear these kinds of evolutionary arguments, sometimes people think what this means is that we are implicitly seeking out healthy mates, right? And this idea is probably not right. And if you think about the 17-year-olds, the 18-year-olds, the 19, 20-year-olds you know, they are not making decisions usually based on health when they're looking for a partner. But they don't have to. So this is an abstract example to make this point. Imagine there's a population of three kinds of people. They're red, orange, and green. And they have their own preferences. For each one, the preference is arbitrary. Red likes red, orange likes orange, and green likes green. If it turns out, it happens to be the case, that there is, with this preference and trait combination, a slight reproductive advantage where greens are going to have 3 offspring to every 2 for orange, for every 1 of red. Arbitrary in terms of the individual preference, but this is an outcome of that. All things being equal, over time, over 10 generations, 98% of this population will have a green preference. So if you're a scientist going and sampling this population, you would say green preference is universal. But it's strictly an epiphenomena of this reproduction that once it keeps going. OK, so what happens in the brain when we see beautiful people? In the back of the brain, in our occipital cortex, there's an area called the fusiform gyrus that is specialized to processing faces, as distinct from areas that process places and other kinds of objects. When we see beautiful faces, this area activates, and it seems to connect with parts in the front of the brain, lower down, where our reward centers are. And these have complicated names like the nucleus accumbens, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, orbifrontal cortex. But it looks as though the experience of seeing a beautiful face is the simultaneous activation of parts of our visual cortex that are specialized for faces and parts of our reward systems, that when those come together, that is, in fact, the experience of beauty. Now, we did an experiment in which we showed people faces of varying degrees of beauty. And in one condition, they were making judgments. In another condition, they were just making an identity judgment, which is, had they seen this face before or not? Beauty wasn't on the table. And what we found under those conditions, that within the occipital cortex, there was still neural activity in response to the beautiful faces, even though that's not what they were being asked about. It appears as though we have automatic beauty detectors in the brain that ping every time you see something beautiful, even if you are not explicitly thinking about beauty. It turns out we have other attitudes about beauty that also seem to be built into the brain. Within the orbifrontal cortex, which is part of this reward system, you find that there is part of the brain that is responsive when people are making a judgment of whether an act is moral or not. And that area overlaps with parts of the brain that are responsive to when someone makes a decision whether someone is beautiful or not. And it also turns out you get that kind of neural activity even if people are not explicitly making a judgment of beauty or morality. So again, it turns out that not only do we have automatic beauty detectors in the brain, we automatically associate beauty with good. Now, this is potentially problematic. It's problematic because attractive people receive all kinds of advantages in life. They get better jobs, they're given more pay. As students, they're given better grades. If they're criminals, they're given lesser punishments. And so we have these kinds of biases built into the brain. And there's the converse of that, which is we've been looking a little bit at effects of facial disfigurement. And on Wednesday, I'll talk a little more in detail about this, which is what we find is that with relatively minor facial disfigurements, viewers make all sorts of social attributes, that these people are less intelligent, they're less competent, they're less hardworking, they're less trustworthy. And this kind of bias is something that seems to be built into the brain, but it's not something that we can't overcome. We need to know about this so that we can judge people on their own merits and not on the happenstance of their looks. But it is magnified. It is magnified by media. So these are just a few examples where it is common in movies to just show someone as being disfigured, and then you don't have to construct a whole backstory about why they're villainous, right? It's just understood. And this happens very early. The Lion King, right? Your little kids got this message very early on, that disfigurement is a shorthand to say someone is evil, right? And this is something that is the dark side of beauty, where all of these kinds of social attributes are impugned on people. So I'm going to leave you with one final idea. It's a bit of a speculative idea, which is that all of these so-called universal attributes of beauty came about during the Pleistocene, right? This was 2 million years ago. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. But the criteria for reproductive success during that time no longer apply right now. We have surgery, we have C-sections, we have in vitro fertilization. We have any number of ways in which reproductive success is not as determined by the same things that killed off our ancestors. Not many people die of parasites in the developed world anymore. And so when you have these kinds of situations, there is a certain amount of drift. And how rapidly that drift happens is not clear. There are some examples in biology where the drift happens very quickly. But in this case, we don't know how quickly this will happen. But what is likely is that over time, these so-called universal aspects, features of beauty will start to drift. And using modern medicine and technology, as we are changing the universe around us, we are also changing the universal nature of beauty. Thank you.